The Boy from Hillsborough. The snow fell heavy over Hillsborough, New Hampshire, the kind that blanketed rooftops and softened the sound of horse hooves on frozen ground. Inside a modest farmhouse, a boy stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the quiet world beyond. Franklin Pierce was 10 years old, and already he knew he was expected to be more than ordinary. His father, Benjamin Pierce, was a towering figure, both in reputation and presence. A hero of the Revolution and now governor of New Hampshire, Benjamin carried his expectations like a sword, sharp and unyielding. Franklin admired him, but more often feared disappointing him. His mother, Anna, quieter but no less stern, filled their home with scripture and silence. Of their 8 children, Franklin was the 5th, neither the eldest nor the youngest, but the one most sensitive to the weight of invisible things. He struggled at first in school, often distracted, his imagination wandering beyond the classroom walls. But something changed when he was sent to study under a private tutor in preparation for college. He began to thrive, not because he loved academics, but because he had found a purpose. He wanted to prove he could be something, not just to his father, but to himself. At 15, he entered Bowdoin College in Maine. It was there he met Nathaniel Hawthorne, a quiet, brooding writer with a love for shadows and solitude. The two became unlikely friends, Franklin sociable and charming, often pulling Hawthorne into the world, while Hawthorne offered Franklin the gift of reflection. Their bond would survive decades and disasters. Yet even in friendship, Franklin felt an unease. He laughed easily, performed well in debates, and climbed social circles with grace, but at night he would lie awake, asking questions he couldn't speak aloud. Why do I feel so empty when I should feel proud? Why does ambition taste like fear? He graduated in the top tier of his class and returned home to a father who nodded once in approval. No celebration, no embrace, only a single sentence that stayed with Franklin long after. You'll go further still, boy, or you'll be forgotten. The words burrowed deep, both a prophecy and a curse. In the dark winters of Hillsborough, Franklin would often walk alone through the woods behind his home. There, among the naked trees and whispering wind, he imagined himself as more than a name in someone else's story. He wanted to matter, not for glory, not even for love, but for the quiet certainty that his life had meant something. Years later, long after those woods were behind him, he would think of that snow-covered boy at the window and wonder if that had been the last time he felt truly safe. Climbing the ladder. Washington City in the 1830s was a place of smoke, whispers, and ambition. Franklin Pierce entered it like a man stepping onto a tightrope, eager, capable, but already wary of the fall. At just 27, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, charming allies and disarming rivals with the ease of a seasoned diplomat. Beneath the polished speeches and clever compromises, however, lay a growing restlessness he couldn't name. Back home in New Hampshire, Jane Appleton waited. Reserved and devout, Jane was everything Washington was not: quiet, principled, afraid of crowds and politics alike. She had married Franklin against her instincts, believing love might temper the life he was chasing. But the capital's glamour quickly became her burden. She hated the noise, the lies, the endless gatherings where wives were expected to smile and nod. Washington was Franklin's world, not hers. Letters between them grew colder, thinner. In public, they were the picture of refinement. In private, they lived like strangers. The distance between their hearts widened in silence. When Franklin was elected to the Senate at 33, one of the youngest ever to hold the post, his father was elated. Jane, though, withdrew further into herself. Their first child had died in infancy, a sorrow she carried like a second skin. Franklin grieved too, but he buried it beneath committee reports and social dinners. Neither knew how to talk about the child they had lost, so they didn't. He became a fixture in Washington, a rising star known for his eloquence and moderation. But power had begun to lose its taste. Every bill passed, every speech praised, felt more like performance than purpose. Franklin began to drink more, stay out later, and smile less. Then, without warning, he resigned. The announcement stunned his peers. A man on the verge of greatness had walked away. He claimed it was for Jane, for family, for peace. But those closest to him suspected something deeper, an exhaustion of the soul, a quiet surrender. Back in Concord, he returned to law practice, determined to live simply. He played with his surviving son, Benny, and tried to rekindle what time and tragedy had dimmed. Yet even in those quiet years, something in him remained untethered, as if he were holding his breath for something he couldn't see coming. One night, walking alone through the snow, Franklin stopped beneath a lamplight and looked up at the sky. The stars above were cold and brilliant. He whispered, "Is this enough?" The question vanished into the wind. It would not be long before the country asked for him again, not as a man, but as a symbol, a leader. And Franklin, still haunted by the echo of his father's words, "You'll go further still, or you'll be forgotten," would answer. A reluctant president. The letter arrived on a bitter winter morning, its seal heavy with expectation. Franklin Pierce, long removed from public life, stared at the words that would alter the course of everything. He had been nominated as the Democratic candidate for President of the United States. Jane stood in the doorway, pale and tight-lipped. She said nothing, but her eyes pleaded with him to decline. Franklin didn't answer right away. He simply folded the letter and placed it on the mantel. That night, he sat alone by the fire, wondering why fate kept calling him to climb when all he wanted was rest. He accepted. It was a quiet campaign, nearly effortless. The country barely knew him, but his uncontroversial image became his greatest asset in a nation unraveling at the seams. He was elected in a landslide, and before the inauguration, everything shattered. While traveling by train to Washington, Franklin, Jane, and their 11-year-old son Benny were in a tragic accident. The car derailed violently. Franklin survived with only cuts. Jane was bruised and shaken. Benny, their last remaining child, was thrown from the carriage and crushed before their eyes. What remained of their world ended in that instant. Jane collapsed inward, refusing to leave her room for months. She believed the presidency was a punishment from God, and that Benny had been taken as a divine warning. Franklin, consumed by guilt, attended the inauguration in a daze. He placed his hand on the Bible and spoke the oath with trembling lips, his voice hollow, eyes lost. No celebratory ball. No smiling family portraits. Only silence. His presidency began in grief and never escaped its shadow. He tried to lead, but his heart was elsewhere. Every room in the White House reminded him of the boy who would never walk through its halls. He drank more heavily, though he tried to hide it. His policies, particularly the Kansas-Nebraska Act, only deepened the nation's divide and stained his reputation. Friends turned their backs. Critics sharpened their knives. Jane, withdrawn and ghost-like, barely appeared in public. She wrote letters to Benny in heaven, convinced he was watching. Franklin, meanwhile, drifted, speeches made, decisions signed, all without conviction. The presidency became a burden he had never truly wanted and now could no longer carry. At night, he would walk the corridors alone, candle in hand, whispering apologies to the shadows, to Jane, to Benny, to himself. Even Hawthorne, once his closest confidant, wrote that Franklin had become a stranger to himself. And still, the country moved forward, faster than any man could follow. A storm was gathering, one that would tear the nation apart. But Franklin Pierce, the man meant to lead, was already broken before the first thunder rolled. The man history forgot. The end of Franklin Pierce's presidency arrived not with applause, but with quiet relief. He left Washington in disgrace, his approval shattered by division, his name spoken more with pity than pride. The nation he had hoped to hold together was splintering, and many blamed him for striking the match. He returned to Concord a hollowed man. Jane, still mourning Benny, lived like a shadow beside him. They rarely spoke. The silence between them had calcified, two people sharing a roof, but not a life. She immersed herself in letters, prayer, and grief. Franklin turned deeper toward drink, seeking comfort in the bottom of a glass that never gave him peace. Old friends kept their distance. Politics had moved on. The country barreled toward civil war, and Pierce once a rising star, was now little more than a footnote. But even in his retreat, he could not stay silent. When the nation erupted into conflict, Pierce refused to join the chorus of blind allegiance. He criticized Abraham Lincoln's wartime policies, defending the Constitution even when his views isolated him. Many called him a traitor, but Pierce wasn't fighting for power anymore. He was clinging to principle, to some final truth that could justify a life soaked in loss. When Jane died in 1863, he didn't cry. Not in public, not in private. He buried her beside Benny and their other children, the whole family together at last, except him. He often visited the graves in the early morning, when the fog still clung to the earth like breath. Alone now, and with nothing left to lose, he corresponded occasionally with Hawthorne, their once vibrant friendship now worn thin. Even Hawthorne, in his last years, seemed uncertain what to make of the man Franklin had become. A man too gentle for the storm he entered, he once wrote. Pierce died in 1869, cirrhosis of the liver. No national mourning. No grand tributes. Just a quiet funeral in Concord, the kind reserved for someone the world had already forgotten. But history is never quite finished. In old letters tucked in archives, in Jane's trembling handwriting and Hawthorne's ink-stained reflections, there are fragments of a different Franklin Pierce. A man who loved deeply, grieved endlessly, and sought meaning in a world that rarely offered mercy. A man who never wanted the crown, but wore it because he believed, however foolishly, that he might do some good. He failed, but not because he didn't care. As the snow falls each winter on Hillsborough, over the farmhouse window where a boy once dreamed of greatness, the wind still whispers through the pines. Not of legacy, not of politics, but of sorrow.